So, Chapter 5, why the Enlightenment project of justifying morality had to fail. It had to fail. It wasn't an accident. It's not like you could have made it succeed or something else could have been done within the scope of that project. No, it had to fail. Now you might say, wait a second, had to fail? No, just keep trying, But think about that. MacIntyre says, no, that's wrong. But why does he think that's wrong? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First off, think about the figures that you're saying got it wrong, right? That you would do better than. So think about the names. Like start like Kierkegaard. He didn't get it right. Kant, no. He didn't. Hume. You're basically saying that people that were on that level of thought, they just that someone's going to come along and do a better job. Probably not, right? It's not really that their fault. It's not that they weren't smart enough. It's that they were, you could argue that. And that's what this says. It's just an accidental one. The project was a good one. They just weren't good enough for the project, right? No, MacIntyre thinks that's nonsense. You're just not going to get someone who's better at the game of the Enlightened project than Kant. Forget it. He's as good as you get within that project, and it failed because the project was doomed to fail. So forget it. So there was a necessary failure built right into the basic foundations of the project. Well, why? So why? And interestingly enough, MacIntyre thinks Kant kind of knew this, and he probably did. The guy was pretty amazing. But in any case, so why did it have to fail? So just saying that those guys are really smart and the odds, that's not really a good argument as to why it had to fail. MacIntyre says something like this: this project had to fail. This project of justifying morality had to fail because, and keep in mind that MacIntyre's critique of this project of enlightenment is often quite different than some modern critiques of the Enlightenment, like the attack on reason and things like that. He's not doing that, right? He's just saying that reason can't do what the Enlightenment philosophers thought it would do, or everything that it would do. He's not saying that it can't do anything, or that it's a fundamentally misguided notion. He's not saying anything like that. Okay, so but why did it have to particularly fail with respect to the grounding of morality? That's the question that we're asking here. And MacIntyre says something like this: the thinkers within this project, what they tried to do was to come up with a notion of human nature, right? Hume lays it right out, a treatise on human nature, right? He's trying to talk about what human nature is. So was Kant, so was Diderot, so was Kierkegaard. They had this project of the notion of human nature, but what they didn't have with it, or what they got rid of, is they jettisoned the notion of teleology. Okay, so whereas you look at human nature when it's discussed by Aristotle and Plato, it's got a teleological structure. Now you might be saying, what does that really mean? Well, what you find in these thinkers in the Enlightenment project when they talk about human nature is that they don't really talk of a goal of what a person could be, or a telos, right? They might talk about human nature as being constituted by, or constructed, or something out of reason, or Hume, we're just kind of like material creatures crammed full of passions and that kind of in the play of the force of the passions or whatever. But there's no teleology really in Hume. There's a little bit in Kant though, but we'll get to that in a second. So this notion of teleology as a telos as a goal, right, is dropped. Right? Now, I'm simplifying MacIntyre's discussion, but Aristotle certainly and Plato certainly had the notion of a telos, of what a human being is kind of destined to be. Much like when we say, "Oh, look at that little acorn," and what is its telos? To be an oak tree, right? And we all pretty well agree on what the nature of an oak tree is and the essence. Think about today when you say, what's a human being? I mean, we are definitely in our day Nobody is very much in favor of saying what a human being really is, because people think that, that imposes, parameters and restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's how a lot of the people like Hume and Kant thought as well, too, that they thought it was much more open. And of course, think about Sartre, existence precedes essence. Teleology is just blown wide open. Everything is constituted out of choice. There's no telos, right? You make up projects, but you make them up. There's no human thing that you are to be, in the way that the little acorn becomes an oak tree, or that Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics clearly has a teleological framework that he works in to, what is the right human life? Well, he's going to talk about it in terms of what a human being, when it's properly developed, what it should be. We don't talk like that anymore. That's enlightenment thinking, that dismissal of teleology. Dump the telos. And again, I'm not laying out how MacIntyre argues. It's just his main points here is once you dump the telos from your discussions of human nature, these moral injunctions, they're going to lose their force, right? They don't have as much power anymore. And so the whole project then of giving these moral injunctions a kind of force that they had under religion, when you want the philosophy to do it under its understanding of human nature, it's not going to cut it, right? So that whole project, it just is not going to work without teleology. So with a teleological dimension, a telos for humans. And so the project doesn't matter how smart you are, even if you're a Kant, it's not going to work. And MacIntyre points out that Kant worried that this whole project of naturalizing and getting away from a telos and all that, he was concerned that ultimately morality is not really going to be fully intelligible. And that's always been a standard criticism, that the purely mechanical, rational way of understanding human beings, as forces in play or kind of like abstract reasoners, that's going to have a problem in a variety of ways with morality. It's just not going to make morality really intelligible. If you think of just people just as kind of like deterministic type machines or whatever, and there's no real notion of freedom and projection and telos and desires and all these kinds of things of fulfilling a potential or whatever. It's just simply you're just pushed along by antecedent states. Morality doesn't make much sense. Like even the notion you might be causally responsible, but we don't think causally responsible is necessarily important. We think blame and morally responsible. You're blameworthy, right? We can't. It's hard to get blameworthy the notion of a concept of being blameworthy off the ground in this perfectly non-teleological structure. So that's basically how MacIntyre is arguing that this project was doomed. It's not going to work. So once morality was pulled off its moorings of tradition and this sort of, this teleologically based understanding and this religious based understanding, it just collapsed, and it was doomed to collapse. So even the smart people like Kant and the gang, they weren't going to be able to pull it off. And Kant had kind of an inkling of how this was going to be a problem. Okay, I've summarized. That's a pretty quick summary of a fairly complicated, to say the least, discussion by MacIntyre, and it's controversial as well. But that's essentially what MacIntyre says. The project had to fail. It was doomed from the start. All right, so why it had to fail, and so not surprisingly, we're going to go back to pre-enlightenment thinking, right? Before everything blew apart and the attempt to put it back, right? Before Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall and the Enlightenment tried to put them all together again. Before all that, that's the morality we want to go back to. But that's for a later video. That's coming. That's coming. We're still just setting up all of MacIntyre. MacIntyre's just he's doing the stage setting. All right, so some consequences, very interesting. So some of the things that are happening, today as fallout, we've seen that, the rise of emotivism and all these kinds of things. Some consequences of the failure of the Enlightenment project. Well, it's not surprising that MacIntyre wants to tell the story now of all the previous attempts, utilitarianism, all these kinds of philosophies that simply they are slides into emotivism. He talks about utilitarianism, Bentham and Mill, and moving on to Sidgwick, and argues, again, I'm not giving all of his arguments, but he thinks that it's all a slide into emotivism. Okay, so that's with the English thinkers. Then the American thinkers, the pragmatists. He argues that they too ultimately they slide into a kind of emotivism. So Dewey and Peirce and all that gang, they too slide into that. And our modern moral experience, he says, has two sides. So we act with autonomy. We each act with a sense of autonomy, and yet, while we act with autonomy, we deprive others of it. That is, our interpersonal relations, because of this latent and sort of emotivist software running in the background of us, our minds and society, is that all our interpersonal relations are ultimately manipulative. And it's kind of a paradox. It's like we act with autonomy and we deprive each other of it. And it's kind of an odd sort of, we're in a paradoxical kind of situation here. We are forced kind of to, because of these, because of this, to deny autonomy to others while striving to preserve it in ourselves. MacIntyre then goes on to consider various issues such as rights and protests and how they become ultimately fiction in this modern discourse of ethics. He doesn't think they're purely fictions, but under this whole collapsed project and all these disagreements, that a lot of these things that people are arguing about and striving for are ultimately fictions. Okay, so there you go. There's some consequences and an interesting idea of why a particular historical project had to fail, and it was necessarily doomed, that ultimately led us to where we are today.